So today we'll take a look at Interzone from Valley, which is not a new module. It was actually released almost 7 years ago, but it's still an amazing module to learn the basics with. It's perfect for beginners to synthesis or beginners to modular and VCV rack, but it's also very useful for more advanced users and it sounds great. I will mention that I have multiple courses online about synthesis and modular, so if you're interested, there's a link in the description to where you can find them. And let's start with an overview of the module. This is a so-called semi-modular synthesizer, so the individual modules are internally connected, but we can still use external sources to manipulate things. As you can see, it's very well designed and everything is labeled. So we have here the VCO section. This is the voltage controlled oscillator that will be the main sound generator, and we can again manipulate it and control it with voltage. Then we have the mixer section. Here we can mix different waveforms, right? Even mix in some noise, right? Or an external source. Then we have the filter. With the filter, we can control the timbre or the color of the sound. Right, this is by default a low-pass filter, so it will attenuate the frequencies above the frequency point. We will see this also more in depth soon enough. Then we have the modulation source and LFO. This is a low-frequency oscillator, so just like the VCO, it will also generate waveforms, but it can go into lower rates than the VCO. This is great for adding movement to things. Right, for example, to the filter. Then we have the envelope section. With the envelope, we can control the volume duration of the sound and also the movement, right? So I can have it fade in and fade out. And then we have the inputs and outputs section where we can use external sources to control various aspects of this synth and use various signals from the synth itself outside of the synth or route them back into the synthesizer. So let's really dig deeper into each section. I want to start with the envelope section or module, since this will be the module that will control the amplitude, the volume of the sound. We have a 4-stage envelope, so 4 parameters that allow us to control the volume over time, and I can manually activate the envelope with this manual button, right? So we have attack, decay, and release, right? They will control the timing of the envelope, and then we have sustain that will control the level in which the volume will sustain at. For example, I can set a longer attack, so the volume will fade in. And I can set a longer release, so as soon as I let go of the button, it will enter the release stage, and the release will dictate how long it will take the sound to fade back to silence. And now the decay and sustain are connected to one another. The decay will dictate how long it will take the sound to go from maximum to the sustain level. And of course, the sustain will control the level. So if I have the sustain on, let's say, about 20%, this will be the level, the actual volume that the sound will sustain at, as long as I hold the button in this case. And for this, let's have a short attack and a short release. Right, and now we can experiment with the decay. Right, so we have a short attack, it will directly go to maximum, then it will quickly decay to the sustain level. And it will stay there as long as I hold this button. We can have a shorter decay time, a longer decay time. Right, even longer. Now I said that the decay and the sustain are connected, so if I have the sustain all the way up, the decay has no function since there is nothing to decay to. Right, I can have a shorter decay or a longer decay. Right, it has no effect because there is nothing to decay to. The sustain is anyway all the way up. The decay will only work if the sustain is not all the way up. So if I have it somewhere here, for example, right now we get a decay time. We also have a switch to switch between short and long envelope times, right? So if I have something, let's say like this, for example, right, this is quite short. Now if I just switch this to long, right, we have shorter times or longer times. We also have cycle mode. So now I can activate the envelope with the button and it will just loop according to the attack and the decay times, right? So no need for sustain for now. Right, and the sustain will actually make the sound drone. So if I take the sustain all the way up, now we just get a drone. Or again, we can have a looping envelope. Now again, we can activate the envelope externally via the gate and trigger inputs. And I want to show you the difference between gates and triggers. So a gate is a binary signal. It's either up or down, 1 or 0, and it has a duration. So a gate can stay open for longer periods. As long as I hold the button in this case, the gate will stay up. You can see this on the scope. When I let go, it goes down. Right, and we can have different durations for the gates. And a trigger is also a binary signal, so it's also either up or down, but it has no duration, or its duration is very short. It's basically a burst of voltage. You can see this here also on the scope. Never mind how long I hold the button. The trigger goes up quickly and goes down quickly, so we get just a burst of voltage. And this is quite important when using gates and triggers with envelopes. So here I have the SEC3. By default, it will output triggers. You can see this here on the scope. Now, if I use the triggers to gate the envelope via the gate input, we kind of lose the whole point of the envelope, since the attack stage depends on the duration of the incoming signal. So we don't get to use the attack stage. The same with decay and sustain. They also depend on the duration of the incoming signal. So we just get release. Right, if I want a longer attack, I will just get silence because the signal is not long enough to hold the attack. Right, we just get silence. But I can change the triggers to gates. In the right-click menu of the SEC3, I can activate clock pass-through, and this will output gates, again, as you can see here on the scope. Right, and now we get the full functionality of the envelope. Right, we have sustain, decay, and even attack. Right, we can have the sound fade in. But again, we also have here a trigger input, a dedicated trigger input. So if I change the signal back to triggers, right, and let me reset here the envelope. Right, so let me use the trigger input, and now we get a different envelope that gives us control only over the fade in and fade out of the sound with the attack and release. So now let's really look at the main sound source of this synth, the VCO. Again, VCO stands for Voltage Controlled Oscillator. So it will generate oscillations, it will generate waveforms, and we can control it with voltage. And the main way to control it is by controlling its pitch via the volt per octave input. Right, volt per octave means that for each change in octave, we have to add 1 volt. That's the relationship between voltage and pitch or frequency. So here again, I have the SEC3. For now, I will just use the gates to gate the envelope. Right, and I have here the VCV oct. This allows me to transpose in octaves. So I will send this to the volt per octave input. Also to a voltmeter, so we can see the amount or the level of voltage. Right, so now if I add 1 octave, I add 1 volt. Right, if I go 2 octaves up, I add 2 volts. You can see this here. Right, if I go down an octave, we add 1 negative volt. Right, and of course we can divide this volt by 12 and get to choose between the 12 notes within an octave. For this I have here a sequence set on the sec 3. Right, so now we have a sequence, we have pitch changes. On the VCO we can transpose things by octave. Right, or freely with a chorus and fine tune. Or we can even lock it to semitones. Right, by the way, we have a second volt per octave input, as you can see here, so we can offset the pitch even further. If now I use, for example, the oct, right, I can still offset it by octaves. Right, we can even add glide or portamento that will add glide between the notes. Right, and we can mix different waveforms on the mixer. So we have by default a saw wave, which is very bright. Let me take it down for a second. There is something I want to show you on the scope. Right, so again, by default, we get a saw wave, but I can change this or mix in also a pulse wave. This is very similar to a gate, and with the pulse wave, you also have control over the pulse width, which is basically the gate length. So now if I bring in the pulse wave, I can control its pulse width with the width control. We also have a sub-oscillator that can also be something else. So if I bring it in, by default it's set to the same pitch, but I can take it lower. Right, we can even have different waveforms here. Right, saw, pulse. But it can also be higher than the original pitch. Right, and another important aspect is noise. We can add white noise, which is very bright. Or pink noise, which is somewhat darker. And this just adds texture to everything. And as I mentioned before, we can even mix in external signals. So here I have the VCV, VCO. I will sequence it with the same sequence. Right, and then send it here to the external input here on the mixer inputs. Right, and then we have here the external control. Right, so I can mix in also external signals. Before we look at the filter section, I want to show you the LFO. Again, LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. So just like the VCO, also the LFO will generate waveforms. But in the case of the LFO, the rate or frequency of these waveforms is by default much slower, which makes them perfect for adding movement to the sound. But of course, also the LFO can be set to higher rates. Now there are a few ways to use the LFO. The main way is by using the internal connection. So I will use again the pulse wave. As we've seen before, we can control its pulse width. But we can also add movement to the pulse width, add modulation to it. And by default, this movement will come from the LFO, as you can see here. And it's called PWM, pulse width modulation. Right now we can control the rate of the LFO or the frequency. Right, and again we can go pretty high. Into what's called audio rates. We have also different wave shapes of modulation. So we have sine, triangle, so up, so down, and square. We also have sample and hold, which will basically be stepped random signal. Right, and we have also noise, so we can modulate things with noise, which is always fun. Right, we also have an internal connection to the pitch. We can use the LFO to add vibrato to the sound at lower rates or create more metallic sounds at higher rates, and this is here you see mode, and it's by default set to the LFO. Right, we can add vibrato or something a bit more metallic. Right, we also have a slew control here to turn more rigid shapes like the sample and hold, for example, into something smoother. Right. Now another way of using the LFO is by using the dedicated outputs and route them back into the synth. So for example, I can use the LFO as another voice. So I will use, for example, the sine wave and connect it to the mixer external input as we've seen before. And now again, we can have the pulse wave and then mix in the sine and take it to higher rates, audio rates. Right, and we also have fine tuning. Right, so we have another voice, basically another waveform. Now we also have a couple of inputs for the LFO. We have the rate input, so we can add modulation or movement to the rate or frequency of the LFO. We have also the reset input, and let me connect this. Right, with each incoming trigger, the LFO will start its cycle again. You can see it starts at maximum in this case. Right, so we can reset the LFO and get something a bit more repetitive. And we have also the trigger input, and this will only have an effect on the sample and hold wave shape. With each incoming trigger, we get a new random value, right? So we can trigger the sample and hold also externally. So now let's really take a look at the filter section. As I mentioned before, we have by default a low pass filter. So it will attenuate, it will reduce the volume of frequencies above the frequency point, which will control the brightness of the sound. So first of all, if I bring in a saw wave, we can see on the so-called spectrum analyzer the brightness of the sound. On the left, we have the lower frequencies, and the more we go to the right, we have higher frequencies. The more higher frequencies we have, the brighter the sound. And with the frequency control of the filter, we can change where the filter will start attenuating the frequency or brightness. We also have a resonance control, which will add a bump at the frequency point. You can see this very clearly here on the analyzer. Right, and this bump can even start oscillating at higher settings. So if I take the saw wave out and bring the resonance all the way up, right, we get a tone that we can control again with the frequency. Right, let me bring this back now. We also have a high pass filter. Right, and a high pass filter will do more or less the opposite. It will attenuate lower frequencies, so lower than the frequency point. Right, high pass filter. Right, you can see it keeps more or less the high frequencies, but it attenuates the lower frequencies, again lower than this point. Right, and if we combine the low pass and high pass, we can get a band pass filter, so it will attenuate lower and higher frequencies, and will keep a sort of a band of frequencies. Now we can choose also the slope of the filter, so how much it will attenuate. By default it's set to 4p, which stands for 4 poles, which is quite aggressive, but we can change this to 2 poles and it will attenuate a bit less. Right, now let me show you the modulation section. Here I have a sequence going. Right, and first of all, as you can see here, we can use the envelope to control the filter. So internally, the envelope will be connected to control the cutoff point or the frequency point. Right, and this will set the amount. We can even invert the envelope. Right, which has a funny sound to it. Of course, we can also use the LFO. Again, this will set the amount of modulation. This works nicely also with the noise waveform. Nice and crunchy. And we can even use here the volt per octave, so basically the pitch information, which means higher notes will open the filter and lower notes will close it. Right, you can hear the higher notes are going through more now. And this works also great for sequencing the filter when having it as an oscillator. So if I set the resonance all the way up, let me take this down for a second. Right, now it's also oscillating. Right, and I can set the frequency and I can also have it track the pitch. Right, again without and with. Now there are a few more things I would like to show you. First of all, the VCA. The VCA will allow us to control the amplitude of the synth over time. It's usually referred to as a voltage controlled amplifier. In this case, it's more of a voltage controlled attenuator. And there are a few ways of controlling it. Of course, by default, the envelope will control it. Right, but we can also set it to gate, so it will be either on or off. Or we can use the dedicated VCA input. So for example, have an LFO controlling it. I will use the sine wave from the LFO. There are also more destinations for the envelope. As we've seen before, we can use the LFO for the pulse width modulation. Right, so let me add here a bit. Right, so now the LFO controls the pulse width of the pulse wave. But we can also use an external signal. Right, so if I set this here to external and I have here a sequencer, I can send the sequencer to the PWM input. And now the sequencer will control the pulse width. Or we can use the envelope, right? We have here the envelope setting. So now the envelope will control the pulse width. Right, fading in and let's say fading out. And this can be also, of course, inverted. We can also use the envelope to control the pitch, right, with the mode here. Again, by default, it's set to LFO. But we can change this to envelope. so here it can be inverted. And Interzone is even polyphonic, so you can use it to play chords. And one final tip is modulating things that don't have an input, right? For example, if you want to add movement or modulation to the envelope, right? We have no inputs, dedicated inputs to control the envelope, but we can use the micromap module from Stormel. They're of course available for free to control it, to map things, right? So I'm using here the internal LFO and I just click the map button, then click what I want to map. And then now the LFO controls the decay, for example, of the envelope. This will of course work with most modules in VCV. But anyway, I hope you could see how deep and yet clear and beginner friendly Interzone is and how great it is for learning the basics. Once again, go check out the courses I have online. I will play us out with an ambient patch I built with Interzone as the only sound source. Cheers.